That was the beautiful call of the western meadowlark, Sturnella neglecta, bringing us in. I highly suggest finding a nice scrubland if you live on the west coast, the west side of the United States. Find a nice bush with a meadowlark on it and just listen to the awesome bird call. Mornings are good to hear these calls, and I wish I could start most of my mornings listening to this call. We have a more complicated episode today, but I have a palate cleanser at the end of the episode for Biota Beat. Welcome to the Dissectify Podcast, the show that gets you curious about the wild world right outside your window, bringing you content every Tuesday night. I should probably specify since I do it pretty late. My name is Nicholas Sines. I'm your host. Today I'm trying to provide a little bit of controversial nature lore that may change how you view every living thing. Big claims today. First, a fact check from last episode. I mentioned the anemone-wielding boxer crab Libia tessellata, a true crab, by the way. The question was, do non-true crabs also molt when they grow? And yes, they do. They also molt. Alright, let's hop in. So, Veritasium, you may have heard of them, a very popular YouTube channel, covered one of my favorite subjects in biology, the selfish gene idea. They covered an important aspect of this called evolutionary stable strategies that I might cover towards the end of the episode. So I thought this would be a good topic for a podcast, and here we are. The selfish gene idea is fairly controversial, but potentially puts a lens on the behavior of all organisms, so it puts it all into context. It's really an amazing lens to view living things through. Organisms change their environment. This is most obvious in animals. They have some agency to be able to seek areas with more resources or run away from threats. In that way, they're kind of changing their own environment. But similarly, other species, just through their outputs, can change their environment, right? Like plants and oxygen. But the question I wanted to start off with is, what is this agency used to benefit? Which seems like an odd question. But when an organism tries to survive and reproduce, is it for the good of the species? Is it for the good of the group? The good of itself? Or is it something else? Every organism on Earth has DNA, so we'll start there. Maybe life somewhere else doesn't use DNA to store its genetic information, but that's a future episode. This is a complicated topic, so there will be many things that I simplify just to make it less messy. But that's what biology is. It's awesome, it's complicated, it's messy. But first, DNA. So the important unit of DNA is called a gene. And for our purposes here, we'll say a gene is the minimum unit that is of DNA that's needed in order to have some meaningful impact on the organism. So this could be physiology, so eye color or arm length, number of petals and flowers, or it could be behavior. This is a simplification because most traits are controlled or affected by many genes and in complicated ways. A quick example to illustrate my point about genes and behavior. I'll have a paper linked in the description. But some researchers were doing experiments with mice, and they found this gene called IL-15R alpha. A really catchy name. But this is the normal version of the gene. And they found some mice that were missing this gene altogether. And they showed some weird behavior. The individuals missing this gene would run 6 times farther on the little provided running wheel in the cage every single night. So we know that genes can have very real effects on organisms, both the body morphology and even behavior. It's arguable that all changes are morphological, which allows behaviors to take place, but again, future episode. But the point is that changes in genes can affect observed behavior as well as morphology. Now, here, dear audience, is where we return to the question I brought up at the beginning of the episode. This was an ongoing debate for evolutionary biologists to try to figure out who is the beneficiary of this agency that organisms seem to have. Every organism has a parent. Well, messy's, biology's kind of messy, so some animals clone themselves. But for the most part, every organism has a parent. Those parents have traits that make them more or less likely to survive. The ones that have traits that let them survive longer means they're more likely to pass on those traits, reproduce, and their offspring will have those traits too. So this genetic variation in the group and different levels of survival, different rates of survival, across many generations ends up becoming what we call evolution. Where these changes compound over a long period of time, the group of organisms you have now looks totally different or acts totally different than the group of organisms you had at the beginning. And if this is what happens, and we're pretty confident that this is how biology works, right? Evolution, natural selection, then we should expect to see individual organisms that try to maximize their chances of survival and reproduction at all costs. So then why do we see cases of seemingly selflessness and cooperation in the natural world? Maybe cooperation is just a good strategy to survive and reproduce. Here's my favorite example that still seems to break the rules. All ants are famous for living in large colonies with specialized roles, and they get stuff done. It works for them. They're successful all over the planet, maybe except Antarctica or something. But they have one queen that is the mother of all workers and warrior ants and so on. If every organism should be expected to try to survive and reproduce, what does a worker ant gain from this situation? They're surviving, but they will never personally reproduce. That's the sole job of the queen ant. The workers will never have any children, so it seems like a problem for the idea that individual organisms work for themselves, right? Why would an ant do this? You might say, well, that's just how ants work, or maybe it's a valid strategy, so why be surprised? Who cares? But, dear listener, the point is, why does the strategy work if we expect all organisms to be struggling to maximize their own offspring? Our question is, at what level does the organism act in order to benefit? So maybe ants are evidence that organisms can work on behalf of the species or the group. I would say not so quick. The efforts of 5 scientists culminated in the selfish gene theory. And they were trying to figure out why organisms acted the way they did. And maybe I should say acted, put it in quotes, because a lot of organisms act certain ways, but it's not a conscious choice, right? They're sort of doing what they do, and, if that leads to them having more offspring, then that gets passed on. But the idea of, and maybe I should state it plainly, right? So the selfish gene idea is that the gene is the level at which organisms operate to benefit. So it's not that the genes make organisms act selfishly, but Instead, it's that the genes themselves act selfishly when they're shaping organisms. So this sort of flips the normal theory on its head, that every organism is striving to reproduce. It's not that, but instead it's that every organism is a vehicle that the genes use to reproduce themselves. And you might say, well, that's crazy. Obviously, organisms act in their own interest to reproduce. It makes sense. But as we discussed earlier on, is that the genes make up an organism's body plan and in some cases can affect its behavior. And this can be a disturbing idea that organisms are nothing more than the puppets of their genes, right? And this is fairly unscientific of me, but I happen to believe that all organisms are influenced by these ideas, if they're true, and we'll keep talking about it, but I think it's also arguable that humans have managed to escape this control in some ways. Call it a soul or call it consciousness. Humans seem to be able to have some agency outside of this coding, but it would be hard to tell. But through these 5 scientists, one of them was called William Hamilton. He had this idea of kinselection, basically that organisms are going to try to help their relatives before they would help organisms that are in the same species, but that are much less related, right? So they're going to help their relatives first. And he came up with this equation that seems to explain why or when you would expect to see altruistic behavior, meaning like, I'm going to help others at the detriment of myself. They came up with this equation. Basically, it's the amount of relatedness you are to another individual times the benefit genetically you would get from helping them has to be greater than the cost to you. So when this is true, when you're really related or would benefit you a lot or some combination of those two, when that's greater than the cost to you, then you would expect to see a altruistic behavior. You're going to help somebody seemingly at the detriment of yourself. And so we can take this equation and come back to the ant concept. And it actually shows some interesting application here. So we're going to have to look at the context of the genetics of the ants, which is kind of weird, different from ours. So a few search terms here, because it might be a little hard to explain over podcast only, is kinselection, K-I-N, selection, and haplodiploidy, which haplodiploidy is the uneven chromosomes distribution amongst animals in a species. So in ants, the females are diploid, so they'll have 2 sets of chromosomes, like we do, and the male ants will have 1 set of chromosomes. So if you're a worker ant, a female worker ant, right, all of those ants are going to have 2 sets of chromosomes, and they're going to get 50% from their father, 50% from their mother, which is the queen. But the 50% you're going to get from your dad is going to be the entire set of chromosomes, right? There's no other set to get. You get the one he has to offer. And then the mother is going to give her half of the DNA for the offspring, but it's going to be the 2 sets of chromosomes that get shuffled around, and then one of those goes to the daughter. So the way this works out is that every worker ant, or sisters, they share their father's DNA. That 50% is exactly the same. And then they'll share 25% on average from the mother. So they're all genetically 75% related to each other, all the worker ant sisters. And in the framework of this equation and the selfish gene idea has some really interesting outcomes. Because like we were saying before, why would a worker ant not want to, go and have its own offspring? So there seems to be an explanation here, because if it were, I don't even know if it's physically possible morphologically, but if a worker ant decided, like, I'm going to go off and mate and have my own offspring, all of those children are going to be 50% related to her. Whereas right now, she's supporting a queen who's constantly producing individuals that are 75% related to her. So it's like she's genetically trapped to benefit more, if we're talking in this selfish gene framework, that she benefits more genetically from supporting the queen producing these sisters than she would going off and having her own children. And when I first heard this, it blew my mind. I was like, wow, the selfish gene idea really seems to have some explaining power. Maybe this is how the real world works. And if it's true for, in this special case that seemed to break the rules, it sort of seemed to hold the idea up as evidence. So maybe this is how the real world works. And if, every living thing operates this way, it's like a frame shift. It's huge. But we had talked about the evolutionary stable strategies, so we'll switch gears a little bit to talk about that. So as we talked about before, right, DNA changes, the world's chaotic, resources are limited. So an evolutionary stable strategy lets invent a species. So their only food that they can gather, the only food they can eat is fruit, right? So you have these individuals, these organisms that have to go to these trees and get this fruit to live. That's all they can eat. Now let's invent a gene with two versions for these organisms. We'll have the me version and the us version. So individuals with the me version are going to go to the tree and they're going to selfishly take what they need, make sure they get what they need. And the us version of the gene, those individuals are going to go over to the trees and they're going to take fruit, but then they're also going to distribute the fruit out between themselves to make sure everybody has something. I may not get as much as I want, but I'll get something. And there is sort of a security in that approach, right? Everybody's going to get something, so if fruit is limited and I'm slower or something, then I'll get something. But now let's take this scenario and change it a little bit. So we'll say that in this entire group, there's only one individual with the me version to selfishly take, and everybody else is an us version. So if there's ever a scenario where fruit's limited, the me version is more likely to get the fruit they need to live and reproduce, whereas the us version, there might be some individuals who don't make it, right? They didn't get enough to eat, they're going to starve. And after enough generations, we might expect to see the me version become more dominant in the group, as a strategy. They've had more children, and now they're a bigger proportion of the group. So this is where the evolutionary stable strategies idea sort of comes in, is that you can have these organisms that are employing some strategy, and given the context, there may be that one version is more likely to win out than the others. And this idea also applies to not just organisms, but in our framework where the genes act selfishly or seem to act in a way that's making sure they themselves replicate. This evolutionary stable strategy idea may also apply to the genes. So there's that extra layer on top. But that's not to say that being selfish or cooperative is better. It's just that there may be some interactions there that lead to fluctuations in success for whatever strategy. Anyways, okay. Thank you for sticking in, whoever stuck through all of that. But selfish gene idea really had a big impact on how I viewed things, and it's a simplification for sure of how the world works, but it seems to have some sort of insight or some sort of usefulness. But we'll switch gears to biota beat, and we're going to keep it light because that was a lot. But we'll showcase an animal, and this week I thought I'd talk about the belted kingfisher. So I really like to go out and take wildlife photography, take pictures of the animals and plants and stuff that I find. And this was one that, had eluded me for a long time. And earlier today I was able to actually see an individual, grab my lens, get a picture. And it was a bit of an adventure. But I was really happy I was able to see this awesome bird. And they're really cool. They're really sporty birds. They're navy blue with these white and black stripes and kind of a mohawk thing going on. Spiked fringe on the top of its head and this long, spear-like beak. And it'll sit over waterways and wait for fish to go by and dive into the water, grab the fish, fly back out, and it'll eat them rinse, repeat. But it's really cool to see. But yeah, I think that's all I got for today. Please leave a review wherever you're listening. Visit Dissectify.com for more nature exploring tools. My Instagram @Nicholas.Signs can be found there as well. Tag me in your photos. I'd love to see them. And remember, you live in a world with so many other species, so get out there and check it out. All right, thanks. Bye.